Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our session. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Mike Clark. I'm a partner here at KPMG. And let me start by introducing the speakers you're going to hear from today. And then what I'm going to do is move through a little bit about housekeeping and agenda. So today's speakers are going to be myself, as I say, partner here at KPMG. Tony Evans is also a partner and who is very close to the government based out of Wellington, and we'll have some interesting information from that business context. Jeff McLucky, many of you may know Jeff, he is going to speak in the areas of really business operations today. Sean Aitken, Sean's going to talk around the project space, and Damien Barrett is going to talk around cloud and automation and those kind of topic areas. So this is our agenda for the day. But our format really is going to be a number of presenters, as I've just introduced to you, but we're going to leave a time for Q&A at the end. So we are recording this session. So to be clear, we are recording the session, and you'll be able to play it back or share it with other colleagues who couldn't attend if you choose to. You will be on mute throughout the presentation, but if you have questions, please feel free to raise them in the chat or Q&A box that's at the bottom of the screen, depending on which sort of version of Zoom you're using in that Q&A area, please. Just to say, these are views that you're going to hear today. They're not specific advice, but they are set out our view of what is kind of facing IT leaders over the next 12 months. We will be very forward-looking. We're looking forward to say a period of 12 months, and our topics today will be a very light touch on security, not because it's not important, but because we feel that's been covered elsewhere, and we have a lot of other areas to cover. So again, welcome from me, and I'm going to pass over now to Tony Evans, as I say, from KPMG Wellington. He's going to talk about the business context and also how the government is thinking about this in a data use and data collection viewpoint. Tony.
Thanks, Mike, and welcome everybody to sunny Wellington. I wanted to set a little bit of context for today's discussion with some economic data and information. The information I'm presenting here today is based upon a presentation that was done by MB's chief economist on Friday afternoon. So it's pretty much hot off the press. The full presentation is available on KPMG's website if you'd like to sort of swing by and take a look at that. But I've just pulled some excerpts of the data from that presentation here today. So late last week, Treasury released five COVID-19 scenarios for New Zealand. The scenarios largely varied around time spent at each of the alert levels. And the first three of those scenarios are modeled here. The blue line that you can see, and this is both GDP and unemployment rates, the blue line that you can see on each of these was our previous forecasts, and they're built on the Treasury's half-year forecasts for economic and fiscal numbers from 2019. So this is prior to any COVID impacts. And you can see from the slides the varying different impacts of the first three scenarios. Now, scenario one is probably the one that I will focus on today. And that's the one really where we are today. And that's essentially 4 weeks worth of level 4 lockdown, followed by an oscillation of levels 1 to 3. So moving out of 4, down to 3, down to 2, potentially back up to 3, down to 2, down to 1, and then cycling through again. So a year's worth of some type of restriction. And obviously the other scenarios can be a lot harsher than those. So even under scenario 1 at the moment, while we've done an extremely good job in New Zealand to get our health measures under control, we're still looking at some fairly serious economic impacts. And scenario 1, which is, I say, our most likely case at the moment, still has our economy shrinking by 13% this year. Other scenarios do quite a lot more greater damage. And if you look across into figure 2 there, under scenario 3, which is a more severe scenario, we're looking at potentially unemployment rising to 26% during that period. Now, for these scenarios 1 to 3, fiscal support from the government isn't modeled in. And so therefore you would expect to see some cushioning, but it gives you a feel for what government thinks are the scale of these impacts. It's a non-trivial situation, obviously. So if we can then have a look and move on to investment expectations, this has obviously a huge, great effect on investment expectations. This is the most recent data from ANZ, from their economic team within the bank. And they are forecasting a net 50% drop in investment expectations. So for those of you working inside large businesses, this is the likely impact that you will see in terms of changes from leadership teams, boards, etc., in terms of investment intentions. What this means when we see a net 50% decrease, that is across all businesses, some of which might be expecting to increase their investment, others expecting to decrease. It's a net decrease overall of 50%. And also there on that slide is a drop in capacity utilization. So this is organizations that have production capacity, fixed assets that they're looking to utilize. 35% of those organizations are already intending to utilize that capacity less going forwards. So you've got a world there where investment and capacity are dropping quite quickly. If we drop on now to the next slide, this is potentially where we see the largest impact. And this is an impact on labor markets. Now, the subsidy helps here. The government wage subsidies help here. And the latest figures are something like 40% of our workforce in New Zealand at the moment is already being supported by these subsidies. But there's only so much cushioning effect that those subsidies can provide. So overall, 54%, a net 54% of organizations expect to reduce their headcount based on this time last year, and already we've seen 28%, almost 30% of organizations have already taken actions to reduce their workforce. So these are quite traditional data sets. They're the sort of data sets we're used to seeing, and the sort of data sets that people utilize on a quarterly basis for sort of what I'd call medium-term forecasting. The challenge that the government is finding with these data sets is they're not moving fast enough. And so they are transitioning to novel data sets, new data sets. And I've included here 4 examples of new data sets that government is looking at. And the idea of these data sets is they give a little bit more real-time data analytics for what's actually happening in our economy. So if we take a look at the first one, this is data from the Ministry of Transport and NZTA, and it reflects the amount of traffic on our roads. So if we look at the light blue line there, that is light traffic. And that essentially is a useful proxy for consumer demand and consumer activity. The bar slightly above it, the gray bar, is heavy traffic. And this is a decent proxy, a useful proxy for industrial activity. And you can see both of those are down around about 60% almost instantly on the instigation of lockdown. You see a little bit of that heavy traffic starting to recover, but we'll wait to see that over the next couple of weeks. Across on the right-hand side is potentially the most useful of the real-time transaction data sets. This is a data set from a single payment provider, a point-of-sale payment provider, and it shows the overall activity or spend in the retail sector at the point of sale. And we can see there that while consumables, which is essentially food and other sort of essential supplies, has gone up dramatically. So we're seeing a 20% increase in the spend on food. Everything else has decreased dramatically. Probably the hardest hit, no surprise there, is hospitality, but also services industry and fuel. The spend on those are very significantly down. Bottom left-hand corner is another one that MB are using, which is weekly electricity usage. And that's mapped by day for the week of 6th to the 12th of April, and that's compared with last year. And you can see there that there is quite, again, a dramatic sort of 15% drop in electricity consumption. And what we can sort of take from that is that, therefore, our consumer home-based electric consumption is nothing like the size of the industrial and commercial and retail electricity that we normally consume at this time of year. And you can see, if anything, it was actually going down that week. The Saturday and Sunday has a marked decrease. And the final graph on this page is company activity. And this is, again, taken from the company's office, and it's near real time. It's a 5-day period, each 5-day period taken from the start of March, and we can see a dramatic decrease in company activity. So that's both incorporations of organizations and liquidations of organizations. The reason that I bring you these data sets to talk about is they're non-traditional data sets. They're new data sets that are becoming available and helping us react to these very sort of fast moving incidents. And there'll be some of the best data sets that we as a country and you as organizations can rely on to understand what's happening as you come out of lockdown. The URL at the bottom of the screen, which we can publish to you afterwards, is where Treasury are storing these indicators, and they're committing to making these indicators available once every week at the moment. There's additional indicators in there, for instance, around border movements, for those of you that are interested in the tourism and other sort of commercial travel aspects. And there's other sort of useful data sets that you can mine and take a look at on a week-by-week basis, as opposed to some of these more traditional indicators that are quarterly. What I would encourage you to do is also start taking this as inspiration to look at the data sets available within your organizations and make some really good calls in terms of future predictions of what your data is telling you in terms of how and when you invest to grow out of this scenario. So I just want to finish off context-wise by sort of giving you a feel for how government is thinking through the COVID-19 issues, and really they're looking at it from three phases. No real surprises. They use slightly different wording from the KPMG phases, but essentially they're the same. Respond is really what we've been doing over the last couple of weeks. It's around cushioning the blow, and the key criteria there being job attachment. So keeping employees attached to employers and helping cash flow for businesses. So examples of this are wage subsidies and pay for leave and other emergency tax measures. We're just now starting to enter into the restart phase, and this is looking at supporting businesses to rebuild momentum. So this is as people come out of lockdown, we move to maybe from a 4 to a 3 or a 3.5 and then down to a 2. How do we support especially small businesses to economically get back on their feet within New Zealand? And this will also involve infrastructure investment going on as well. So the so-called shovel-ready projects that could be pretty useful for New Zealand. And then longer term, again, recover. So reimagining what a future for New Zealand looks like. And so what does a productive, sustainable and inclusive New Zealand look like in a post-COVID world? So hopefully that gives you some context in terms of the economic context for the session today. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Mike.
Thank you, Tony. I thought that was sobering, but certainly fascinating data sets. Let me just set a little bit of, to build on that, set some context around the technology impacts that then drives. So we think that you've been in the response phase. I don't think you need me to tell you that. You've been enabling working from home or remote working, and you deserve a huge pat on the back. We know, that so many technology shops have been working so hard to make that a reality. Most business continuity plans never developed to address the absolute huge shutdown that level 4 brought so quickly. I know we've said on the slide there that it's complete, and I think it'd be better to say it's largely complete, because I know I've heard back from several people saying, well, still got a fair bit to do to, to go back and fix some of the things that we had to almost put sticking plasters over to get things done. So many organizations, you had remote connectivity for perhaps for knowledge workers. You've added this important process worker group like customer service people, contact centers, accounts receivable, which means you've had to add other systems to remote access. Again, easy to say, not easy to do, done a great job. And you had to deliver a whole set of new tools. We certainly are a recipient of the Teams, which we were using perhaps very lightly at the beginning. And now here we are, we live day to day on Teams. And our market feedback is that several organizations are continuing to deliver significant IT projects, and others are continuing to develop business cases in this mode. So it's not that everything has stopped. We think now we're just about to move to the change phase, and one would hope that we're going to move, say, down the levels of lockdown soon. And we think the next 6 months is around this change phase, which is to respond to the economic and operational impacts of level 3 and level 2, hopefully down to level 1. And the market feedback is that, the IT projects and business cases are being changed, are being impacted by border restrictions and similar issues. So project resourcing might be changed if you're going to bring offshore resources in. Project timelines will be impacted by that potentially to add some time for remote working. Even we're aware of a client who's rethinking a product selection based on the access to people. And of course, the support model for a go live, again, is changed if there were to be resources coming from offshore. So the change phase is quite significant, but then we move to a normalizing phase, which we think goes from October 2020 onwards. And that's about locking in new business models as we return to hopefully something that resembles life as it was prior to the COVID-19 situation. So the common themes which impact us as technology leaders, we're hoping that New Zealand will have flattened the curve. I think all the evidence suggests that's the case. Hopefully that stays the case, but borders are likely to remain closed or partially closed for some time, making New Zealand much more standalone, which will impact supply chain. They'll continue to be a bit disjointed, requiring some more collaboration, such as that offered by the NZTE marketplace. And that's export and import, but also local supply chains. Business will gradually reopen, although social distancing will remain, which means working from home will continue. We think it starts with social distancing, but it remains for life-work balance, it remains for environmental impact, and the remote tools that have been deployed will continue to be used, and operations will also continue to be remote, because previous face-to-face activities, such as sales, account management, will continue online. Challenging to develop new businesses that way, or new clients and customers that way, but I think it is part of our new world. And finally, efficient processes win. Efficient processes and systems will become more important than ever, because swivel chair interfaces are much more difficult to overcome in a distributed workload or a distributed team. So our view is that cost will be under pressure, technology demand will not stop. It's going to be driven by these changes. Prioritization is much more important than ever. Stopping all tech projects isn't the answer, but neither is just pushing on regardless. Rapid delivery of tech and automation matters. Speed to market does matter. And it's time to be agile with a little a and agile with a big A. It's time to change thinking a little bit. So let's get into that in a bit more detail. I'm going to hand over to Jeff McLuckie. You may know him as a video blogger on LinkedIn. And he's going to start with something that's going to be a pretty big issue for many organizations, which is around managing IT cost. Jeff.
Thank you, Mike. Now, as Mike said, I'm going to cover cost pressures on IT as we go through this session. Now, I've been asked to please reassure everyone that I'm not in the office. This is a green screen and an image I found on Google. I am social distancing at home. Now, as Mike said, if you're not already, we're expecting that most organizations are going to be under pressure to deliver cost reductions as part of wider business resilience and response. We're already seeing organizations implementing pay and headcount reductions. You've probably seen 2 Degrees, NZME, and a number of others, even our own MPs doing so. Now, while we acknowledge that some level of this is likely to be inevitable for many, we also believe there's other areas that can deliver savings without impacting your ability to move quickly in future. And when we look at cost savings, it's important that you are making decisions based on real and hopefully accurate data. While this seems obvious, it can be difficult to cost what delivering an entire service or system is without a cost model. Now, when speed is of the essence, you may have to make do without one, but you should be using some form of data. Your analysis should be structured and dispassionate. These are not easy decisions to make, and without taking this type of approach, it's easy to get lost in individual cases, losing sight of the bigger picture. Now, there are a lot of areas to consider for cost saving. I'm going to cover 3 at a high level: technical, delivery, and commercial. And I'm going to start with the technical area. So for those of you with on-premises infrastructure, it's time to take a hard look at what can be sweated, and Kiwi organizations are very good at sweating their assets, and what investment you can defer. Now, your plans for capacity and growth may be very different in the near future against what you were planning. So expansion of your technical estate may not be as pressing as it was previously. In the same way, extended warranties on hardware may be a cost-effective stopgap rather than all-out replacement. Now, cloud also represents an option to rapidly move off legacy platforms with their associated costs and challenges, or avoid large-scale upfront investment. As a service, offerings in areas like call centers or even more traditional server capacity can scale up or down quickly, and pragmatic, rapid adoption of cloud where it makes sense can deliver cost transparency and reductions in total cost of ownership. Now, clear costs at scale per user or per unit with no long-term commitments, offering the ability to clearly forecast spend, can be incredibly useful in periods of uncertainty. The last technical area is around consolidations of systems and services. Now, most organizations I've worked with have had an application or systems consolidation project of some shape or form in various stages of execution. But what we're looking at now is a clear imperative to remove duplication and unnecessary cost, resulting in hopefully a leaner technology landscape. I'm not saying this is easy. I've been involved in enough of them to know that they can be incredibly complex and also quite political, but they can be much more palatable than headcount reduction. Now, in the delivery space, you need to be asking yourself if there are things that IT does today that can be scaled down or even turned off. While the need in some areas, and I'm thinking cybersecurity, remote working, online channels, will continue and in many cases increase, demand in other areas, and specifically areas like on-site support, may reduce. So in the new operating environment we found ourselves in, it's important for IT to deliver whatever you define as core business, which may mean making hard decisions about what is and what isn't offered to the wider organization. The second question is, are there capabilities that it now makes more sense to deliver through suppliers and partners rather than maintaining an internal capability? Architecture and development are common areas I see clients of all sizes wrestling with, given they are often difficult and expensive to hire and maintain. As with many of the areas we're discussing, this is a balancing act between reducing carried cost and retaining valuable knowledge and IP within the organization. Now, some organizations may find themselves in the opposite position, with internal teams with reduced workloads that can be retasked to support or deliver activities previously done by suppliers or to fill project roles. This presents an opportunity to keep teams busy and potentially increase your speed of delivery. But you need to be mindful that many hands don't always make light work. We would suggest starting with internal teams supplementing project teams rather than full-scale rip and replace. Now, you also need to take a hard look at your contracts. Have a look at the services you are currently receiving and the contracts they align to. A rapid review should quickly highlight those that need to be changed or even cancelled. Some common areas to look for are on-site services that can no longer be delivered, user or capacity-based contracts that may need adjusting, or grandfathered or rolling contracts that can be renegotiated on more favourable terms. And you often find that in the telco space. It's also important if you're signing new contracts, either as a result of an in-flight project or as part of a response activity, you carefully consider the terms and lengths of these. You don't want to be signing up for 5 years of support services for an interim solution you don't expect to be using in 6 months' time. There are some additional considerations in this space. Those strategic suppliers that you see being part of your response should be treated differently to more commodity services. While IT is under cost pressure today, supporting suppliers today will be remembered in the months ahead. That's it from me on cost, and I'll pass you over to Sean Aitken, who's going to cover project delivery and prioritization.
Thanks, Jeff, for providing some really useful pointers on how to manage IT cost pressures in a smart way. Today, I want to explore with you 3 questions in relation to COVID-19 and projects. What have you learned? Will you prioritize projects differently? And will you execute projects differently? So the first question, what have you learned? Yeah, there's a quote, never waste a good crisis, and there are learnings to be had from COVID and its aftermath. Talking to people, they're saying they've responded in record time, largely delivering tactical outcomes, things like enhanced remote access, modifying online shopping for essential items. But there have been some misses, and I'll give you an example. A company where we relaxed, or there was relaxation around essential items, had to modify their online shopping portal. Their competitors did it near immediately, and they were 24 hours late, and as such likely lost revenue. From the outside, it looked as though they were focusing on getting a fully functional solution, as opposed to adopting a startup mentality of saying, what's the minimum I can get away with? How can I stand something up and then build on it? So something to consider, as you've gone through COVID, have you been able to increase delivery cadence? If not, why not? And if you have, how are you going to apply it going forward? Second question, will you prioritize your projects differently? Everyone I'm talking to is saying they are reducing the number of projects, and that's something everyone's going to have to do. Largely though, they focused on reducing them for short-term cost. Now the trick's going to have a really effective prioritization approach. So you can understand the impact of stopping or deferring projects, as well as focusing on the things that are left behind are the right ones. It will vary for each of you and the impact COVID is having on you. For example, if you're in the airline or tourism industry, unfortunately you're in survival mode, whereas if you're in banking and finance, you're probably in disruption. So tips and considerations. What are your business priorities and what are the benefits? Is it immediate cost reduction? Is it revenue growth for new channels and offerings? Customer service, risk mitigation. I'd also recommend keep your focus very short term, and by that I mean no more than 6 months. With the level of uncertainty in terms of what the recovery will look like, going up much further than that is at the moment largely meaningless. And I'd also recommend break your projects into smaller pieces to develop a minimum viable product. Put in place clear checkpoints to stop, start, or continue projects. So I'd say anything that doesn't have a material benefit, for example, a proof of concept or part of an overall solution within 3 months, at those checkpoints, you need to look at it really carefully to say, should we stop it, start it, or continue it? So have you rationalized your projects to reflect your business outlook? And are you breaking your existing projects into bite-sized chunks? Last question, are you going to execute differently? So coming back, clients are delivering things faster and reducing the focus to a smaller number of projects. They are reducing what they work on. But observations and thoughts. Again, focus on a MVP, minimum viable product, or proof of value, and be really clear on what's good enough. The number of times people say we absolutely have to have this requirement to go live, yet you can go live without it, and either people don't need it or you can stand it up very quickly. So focus on what's good enough, what do you need to do? Keep all parts of your project really simple, and that's all the way from governance through to execution. Take a risk-based approach. An example here could be data migration. Traditionally, we would migrate all the information from an old system to a new system. An alternate approach is leave it in the old system, ring fence it, and just give people access as and when they need it. Just think, what is it I actually absolutely have to do? You've heard that teams will continue to work remotely. So use the tools that are available for communication, collaboration. Things like Jira, Confluence, Teams. It just makes things easier. You've got single versions of the truth that can be accessed anywhere, anytime, and it reduces rework. So it's just a no-brainer to get those up and running. Something a bit tactical is what we found is adapting your delivery style for remote working. Historically, we'd have a very collaborative approach where we're face-to-face and say, how do we co-build, co-design this? What we're finding with remote access is it's a lot more effective if you can stand up a proof of concept or proof of value and say, how about this, would this work? Just think back to any of the video calls you will have been in the last week where there's a question, any questions or thoughts, and it's deathly silence, as opposed to, hey, here's something we could do, what do you think? Last point here is look at the skills you're going to need and where they're going to come from. It sounds a bit mercenary, but there will be opportunities to pick up skills that you previously couldn't get. So in summary, I had 3 questions for you in relation to projects. What have you learned? Will you prioritize your projects differently? And will you execute them differently? So I'll hand over to Damien, who's going to share some insights with you in relation to automation and the effective use of technology. Damien.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. It's really interesting the impact around project delivery in a post-COVID world and the different things that we should be thinking about. So today I'm going to be talking about cloud automation and also technology for today and for the future. So with cloud, we've seen organizations leverage 3 key benefits: agility, scalability, and also an increased ability to automate manual tasks. So the first of those benefits, agility, is where technology is being used to enable rapid business change. So the rapid lockdown implemented by the New Zealand government really meant that local organisations had limited time to respond to those restrictions. I like the example that Sean just talked about, where there's that sort of opportunity cost, where organisations aren't able to respond as quickly as their competitors, and the potential revenue loss associated with it. So what we're seeing is that organisations have embraced modern ways of working and architectures such as cloud native applications, use of microservices and agile development techniques. And when I say these, I mean those that are doing it well, because there's many who haven't, have seen and will continue to realise the advantages of being able to execute more quickly than their peers. So the second benefit, scalability, is the ability to ensure that you've got sufficient capacity through a utility-based computing model. And utility-based computing model is when you pay for what you use rather than what you have. So we've seen challenges where on-premises infrastructure and networks with fixed capacity are unable to support the increased adoption of digital channels that has happened due to COVID-19. The ability of cloud to enable new or increased capacity has been and will continue to be of large benefit. An obvious example here is the increased adoption worldwide of collaboration SaaS tools such as Zoom or Microsoft Teams. So the third benefit is leveraging modern technologies to facilitate and enable automation. So the transition to a remote and distributed workforce for many has been almost instantaneous. And this nature of working remotely has really exacerbated deficiencies of manual workflows, especially those that are paper-based. It may sound unbelievable, but we've seen examples such as payrolls where the back office staff have been working at home over the phone, filling in paper-based forms, and then in some cases where they don't have scanners, they're actually relying on postal services to move these around. And what we're seeing with automation and RPA in the market is that many of these projects are in the pilot state, and there's huge opportunities here to rapidly automate manual tasks. And we'd recommend starting immediately by looking at areas with increased demand and where you have insufficient capacity. So the other side of the coin is that it's not all its benefits, there's considerations as well. So although it's great to be able to take advantages of the benefits that cloud provides, you need to think about things such as risk, security and compliance and ensure that they're on the radar to support sustainable and supportable information systems. So you can see in front of you at the moment, we've got the KPMG Cloud Transformation Framework. And that's our approach to consolidate and communicate best practices and learnings from cloud adoption across many different industries, and including consideration across different pillars, such as those that you see on the screen in front of you, such as risk management and other areas such as operational excellence. So many organizations take these sorts of things as an afterthought just before go live. So in normal circumstances, it's certainly not ideal because of the cost and the time required to fix these things retrospectively. But today there's that commercial urgency, which means that retrospective change sometimes just isn't tenable. And there's that unfortunate trade-off that we're seeing being made because areas like security weren't considered up front. So while organizations might be making what feels like the right decision now, what you don't want is to have things like significant data breaches and negative media attention in 3 months' time. You don't want customers to be losing faith in your digital capability, where due to current events, these digital capabilities are going to be more key than they ever were. What we've seen is, similar periods of uncertainty and change before, such as what we witnessed in the global financial crisis, and the way that you and your organizations manage risk, compliance, and where relevant alignment to regulations is absolutely key. So our recommendation for cloud adoption is that now more than ever, it's critical to use a proven framework to enable rapid decisions whilst also ensuring appropriate consideration is performed across areas such as risk, security, and compliance. And then the final theme is the alignment of business strategy to IT. So even before COVID-19, we've been witnessing a global trend where technology is moving from becoming a siloed area of the business to an enabler of business strategy to even a key component of business strategy itself. So this increased use of technology to stay connected across all areas of business and with your customers is that there's been an uplift in the use of digital service offerings through necessity. The increase in adoption rate has been most significant for the demographic of less tech-savvy customers who would have historically favoured non-digital channels. And this is all the way through from internet banking to online shopping. And we expect this is going to have long-term benefits. So increased benefit of having self-service capabilities, the ability to do origination through digital channels. We're seeing increased use of online shopping. I mean, just last week, Countdown created an online-only shopping facility. So what does this mean for you? What does this mean for your organization? So once you're out of that response stage that Tony alluded to earlier in the presentation, it's going to be necessary to adjust your thinking about the impact of business strategy, the resulting technology strategy, and what your future state architecture will look like. So while we've been talking about the alignment of technology with business strategy, following on from this theme, I'm going to pass you back to Jeff, who's going to talk about the topic of supporting the business. Thanks.
Thank you, Damien. Now, as Damien said, having a holistic cloud transformation framework or cloud adoption framework is incredibly useful. I've been involved in a multi-year cloud project, and having that framework there really makes it easy to make sure you're asking the right questions and ticking the right boxes early in the process. Now, as we move forward through the change phase, you should be thinking about how your team and environment will support the business in uncertain times. What your business does and how it does it may be very different in the near future, and you need to be able to respond to these changes. There's 3 areas that we think you should consider: flexibility, suppliers, and upskilling. Now, we've already talked about how the sudden shift to working from home, as well as the sudden uptick in online shopping, quickly exposed those organizations that were unable to flex their technology environment. As business models change, we expect to see more need for flexibility, both in the technology environment and in how your team delivers services and capabilities. From a technology view, we've already talked about cloud's ability to rapidly deploy and scale, and it also allows you to rapidly scale down when needed. As you look at potentially removing systems and capacity that may have been deployed as a stopgap or interim measure, having the ability to rapidly remove it and its associated cost is a significant benefit. This also extends to licenses and contracts, both in cloud and on premises. We discussed avoiding locking yourself into long-term contracts, but ensuring that you're able to scale your services both up and down is really important. From a team perspective, while the focus currently is likely to be on the cost element of IT teams, are you able to access the skills and capacity you need to support how the business will operate in the future? And can you flex this as those needs change? I previously discussed what makes sense to source from suppliers rather than maintain in-house, but we cannot assume that suppliers are an endless source of skills and capacity, and many are facing the same challenges you are today. This presents both a challenge and an opportunity. Many of your current suppliers have likely been selected using criteria that may not be relevant today. The services and delivery messages that were business as usual are likely to be different in the future, the most obvious example being remote delivery. Now is the time to take a hard look at your suppliers, as you did with your contracts, identify those that you believe will be strategic, and work with them to support both parties as you move through this change. However, this is also an opportunity to look at different suppliers. Specialist, niche, or just not the obvious providers may be a more attractive proposition now, and many will be looking to establish new client relationships. And geographic proximity is unlikely to be as much of an issue as it was before. Now, we've talked about using internal resources to supplement projects. We've discussed challenges getting skilled resources into New Zealand, but it's unrealistic to expect team members to immediately fulfill new roles without adequate upskilling. As the mad rush to get everyone working from home hopefully dies down, you have an excellent opportunity to get team members to develop skills. These might be technical, and we've had a couple of our team members earn Microsoft certifications in the last month, or more ways of working focus. I'm thinking agile or other methodologies. Now, to make this successful, teams need to have a development plan in place, or at the very least, general guidance on where to focus. Again, using ourselves as examples, our Lighthouse division, who handle our data and analytics activities, have training pathways for their team members. If this doesn't exist, pull one together for your team, aligned to those skills and services you defined as core business when we discussed cost. Investing in your people today will position you to more effectively support your business and lead change in future. Now, that's all from me. I'm going to pass you back to Mike to work through any questions we may have. Mike.
Thank you, Jeff. That's great. Yeah, let's open this up to Q&A. I think you should be looking at a bunch of smiling faces ready to take your questions. Before I actually close out on that, you'll notice that on each of the people, there is an email address and telephone number. So we very much welcome direct contact and direct communication, just talking about various issues if you don't think we get to your question or we don't answer it to you in that sort of full detail. So I've got one that came through via text to me, and I think I'm going to put this to you, Sean, if that's all right, and others can top in. The question really is, how can we move quickly while we are reducing cost?
Okay, thanks, Mike. I'd probably start with, as one of the questions I had, what have you learned from COVID? and it's looking at the pace with which you can move. And I'll give the example. If you think of a traditional, how can we reduce cost? In a normal environment, you're probably going to have to write some type of business case, do a full analysis, fire it through, get it approved. It's going to depend on the industry you're actually in and how quickly you need to move. But stripping away, I suppose, the unnecessary layers of governance. So saying, if you're in, say, for example, accommodation and transport, you need to reduce very, very quickly. You can guarantee you're not going to spend a week writing a business case. You're going to say, we need to do this now. We've looked at the risks very quickly, socialize that with the exec and make it happen. There'll be others where it's taking slightly longer, but it comes back to what have you learned is if you apply a bit of rigor, a simple framework, but keep it simple, you can move through very, very quickly to say, these are the things we want to focus on. So long-winded way of saying, use some type of framework, keep it simple, focus on a small number of things, but do it just do it very, very quickly. Not sure if any of the other panelists want to add to that.
No, okay. On that basis, then I think that wins the answer. So there's a couple of questions here, Damien, that are have been raised. They're slightly different questions, but I think they're quite similar in terms of their the tone. One is, why can't we simply move individual workloads to the cloud? And the second question is, should we move any workloads before having a cloud adoption framework in place?
Yeah, and they're interesting questions. Thanks, Mike. So to the first question, why can't we simply move individual workloads to the cloud? Well, absolutely you can. What we're saying is that you just need to ensure that appropriate consideration is given to the different challenges that cloud provides. So without going through our framework, I'll just give you some examples of things that you might want to think about. So is that move to cloud secure? So certainly what you don't want is to have data loss of your important or mission critical or regulated organizational data. I'm sure that you've all seen the recent media articles around insecure setups of Zoom, where people have been dive bombing in on sensitive corporate calls. Other areas of consideration is it compliant? So for those of you who are in regulated industries, you need to ensure that what you're doing is still compliant with regulations that are in place. What's the cost impact? So for example, you don't want to lock yourself into a 5-year contract for what seems like attractive discounts in such an uncertain period. So consider things like the TCO, look to make things which are reversible decisions. And finally, is it going to be supportable from an operational perspective? So absolutely, we think that you should be considering cloud. Absolutely, we think that you should be considering migration of workloads where it makes sense, but just ensuring that you think about the associated risks and application of best practices. And that's where tools like a cloud transformation framework can really help you.
Thanks, Damien. Can you just add to that one piece around the idea of getting onto cloud and getting off cloud, and that piece of flexibility? I've heard you speak about that many times.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be honest with you, it's a bit of a depends question, but one key area would be what Sean touched on earlier, which is what do you do with your data? So when you're migrating to the cloud, data is a very important consideration. Does it stay on premise? Do you migrate that data? Do you integrate? These are all the sorts of things that will facilitate the ability to move forwards and back and ensure that you may not be locked into a particular solution, or also giving you the long-term benefit of the services that you're procuring. And I think that ties into, are you making this as a tactical decision or a strategic decision? Because that will greatly change the approach that you take.
Terrific, thank you. A really good question here. Hi team, the Ministry of Finance said on Friday that the future of work has arrived. How can New Zealand use this crisis and its subsequent recovery to improve our productivity? That's a very simple answer, obviously. Tony, over to you.
Thanks, Mike. Look, there's an interesting quote that came out from the CEO of New America last week, who is New America is a US-based sort of fairly central think tank. And their CEO described coronavirus as a time machine into the future. And her explanation was that for those of us who are sort of future thinking oriented, the sorts of changes we're expecting to take decades are now happening within weeks. And that's being accelerated by the COVID-19 response. From our perspective, I think for New Zealand, the fact that we are managing things so far so well bodes very well for the New Zealand Inc. brand and bodes well for our sort of quite an exciting recovery for us. The sort of thing I think that we're seeing now is the ability to open up new markets. So an example would be, I think, Singapore, where we saw one of our clients last week, up until now, exporting a single container of fresh fruit per week, and that's tripled to 3 containers. Why is that? Well, because New Zealand's becoming a trusted brand, and we can leverage that quite heavily going forwards. With that trust comes a lot of responsibility, though. So as we're seeing in China now, people venture back out from their very tough lockdown. They are conservative and risk averse. They're looking for real clear provenance of the produce that they're consuming, and things like technical solutions like blockchain to provide provenance information at the point of sale to consumers in international markets are vital. But then we need to think not just about the technology solution to that, but also the quality and the veracity of the data that we write into those sorts of technical solutions. So I think it comes back a little bit to some of the comments both Sean and Damien have been making around sort of agility. And Damien talked about one-way and two-way doors. I think be adventurous in terms of the opportunities that this crisis presents to you, and look for those doors that are two-way doors, things that you can step through, that the decisions you make have limited consequences. So that's not long-term exposure to costs, it's not long-term damage to your brand, but allows you to explore areas that you might not have been in prior to these issues. So I think it's probably a sort of a long-winded answer, Mike, but probably the best I can come up with.
Sorry, great. Thank you, Tony. I'm going to throw to Jeff on a couple of topics here that are kind of similar or relate to each other anyway. Have you seen any tools that can help build up a total operate cost model of running a service, e.g. ERP, CRM, that can be used to help with decisions around simplification, cost reduction? And another question is, what cost frameworks would you suggest for cost out? And Jeff, I think this sort of leads into a technology business management TBM discussion, doesn't it?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and I think the challenge that a lot of organizations that have tried to do this in the past is, what are the building blocks that make up those costs? How do we define them? What are the levels? And technology business management, or TBM, is, at its most basic, a pre-built almost cost model framework to develop those costs. And as part of a wider cost out, it really gives you sort of the predefined, here's the buckets to put your costs into, here's how they roll up to the next layer up, and here are the layers that do that. So yeah, TBM, or technology business management, is probably a really good place to start if you're looking to build that. Again, the devil is always in the details, and how you build that cost model and make it actually repeatable and updatable is where the real challenge lies.
And do you have a little bit more detail about where people can go and to look at TBM resources? I think that...
Yeah, sure. So look, TBM as a framework, it's a global organization. If you search for technology business management, you'll find them. But more specifically on our website, we've talked a lot about IT cost and how we can apply, using TBM as the framework, how we can undertake that cost activity.
Yeah. Okay. I've got a really good question here, and I think I'm going to push it to you, Sean, which is... And I think it's very real, in the sense of the risk of burning people out. IT teams have been working hard for weeks now, undertaking fast track projects now, while people are already under pressure and tired, I guess, is likely to lead to poor implementations as well as poor outcomes for our people. What tips would you give to ensure good health and well-being outcomes for our people? I think not an easy one to answer, but a very good question.
No, it's a really, really good question. It does vary by industry, and what I mean by that is, if you were in tourism, and I keep using this as an example just because it's so easy, you're in tourism or airline industry, unfortunately you probably don't have the luxury of taking your foot off the gas. But what you can do is you've just got to be honest with your team, as saying, here's what we've done, give them breaks wherever you can, but here's where we think we're actually going to have to try and get to, and just be completely as transparent as you can. Yeah, some of the advantages we're seeing, so I just need to move my headset up, things like personally at KPMG, it's the whole, so you're working at home with children, it's not expected that you're going to be here between 9 and 5. It's saying you will be having, you're going to have some outcomes that you're going to try and deliver, but there's absolute flexibility around when and how you do that. So it's a long-winded way of saying, engage with your people, talk to them, be honest with them, and it's going to depend on what your business imperative is. We'd all like to say, yes, you can take your foot off the gas, recharge, regroup, and for some people, that's just not going to be an option. So not sure, hopefully that helps a wee bit.
Okay. All right, Tony, would you like to add to that one? I don't know if I'm putting you on the spot a little there, but I don't know if you've got something to add.
Yeah, look, I think it comes back to this idea of prioritization. We can all be working on every project under the sun and then add in a whole bunch of crisis portfolio stuff as well. But I think if you're working through that prioritization piece, and Sean explained it well, really, in terms of sort of stepping through the process of prioritization. But I think take a look at it and you will figure out that some projects still make sense. Other projects just simply need to stop in this environment. I appreciate that projects have a momentum of their own and not everyone can be simply shut down tomorrow, but those that you've got discretion on, if they no longer make sense, then be very focused and shut those down. And others will need more information in terms of making that decision. And my suggestion is if you can't get that information very quickly, they'd probably fall into that shutdown category. So I think a lot of it is around working with your stakeholders to really brutally focus on what has to be done now and what is important but can actually be deferred into the near future.
Yeah, that's exactly right. They probably can't do the same amount, and demand and supply are always issues, aren't they? I'm going to stay with you, Tony, because you and I were talking about this earlier. There's a couple of questions that relate to the fact that working on these tools that we're talking about, the collaboration tools, the Zoom that we're on, the Teams, etc., creates a different set of issues for both the employee and the employer. So there's a couple of questions that relate to that, sort of how that, the recognition of remote working, how you regulate remote working, change of regulation on that kind of area. I'll sort of throw that to you because, what you were talking about earlier sort of fit that bill.
Sure, look, I think we're all technologists by trade on this call, and we get thrown a technical problem and we leap into it and we try and solve it from a technical perspective. What I think we're learning now is that with modern cloud-based technologies, as sort of Damien's explained, that you can move quickly, you can make things happen, and you can stand up capability very quickly. What we're finding now is it's then the regulatory requirements and some more of the subtle contractual requirements that might then prove to be the hiccup. The example I'd give you is our business, whereby we're very careful in terms of the advice that we give our clients, and we provide written advice, and it might be very specific in the areas of tax or finance or audit opinions. If we then rush into an online collaboration tool with those clients and provide information within those online collaboration tools, is that seen as advice? Is that seen as written advice from KPMG? So we are really thinking through, and I think it's pertinent to most of you, as you're engaging with your clients, if you're sharing information in some of these tool sets, what's the legal status of that information set that you've shared? Equally, we talked a little bit before about privacy, confidentiality, and security. A lot of us have a fairly well-defined understanding of security as it relates to sort of sharing final artifacts and deliverables and production to our clients, be it a contract, be it a mortgage arrangement, whatever. But we're less defined as to what sort of constitutes those interim deliverables. So I think as you're standing up these productivity tools where you are collaborating with your clients, careful thought as to how and what you share and when, and under what status would be really important.
Thanks, Tony. I'm just going to throw this one out, I think, to you, Jeff. There's 2 or 3 questions again that come together. I think they kind of blend. And I'll read this one because I think this one actually summarizes it very nicely. Do you have any advice on managing the risk of key partners' financial sustainability? And the second is, another question earlier was that you mentioned that there may be a need to change for different vendors, and why you're saying that, essentially. So I think that's a kind of a 2 pieces of the same coin there, if you could.
Sure. So I'll start with the second half first. I don't think there's a need necessarily to change your suppliers. I think it's more you need to take a hard look at your current suppliers and the services that you're getting from them. I think I'd describe it more as now's a good time to look at those things and see if it is the right time to change. And the reason for that is, as we said, the criteria you use to select those suppliers in the first place may have changed. And look, the most obvious is proximity. So, we wanted someone that we could look and touch and feel, and they can come into our offices. If everyone's at home, that may no longer be the case. So I don't think it's you need to change your suppliers. I think it's more of now is a great opportunity to look around and see if there is an opportunity to change for a better outcome. And the first part of the question about the stability of those partners, look, it is challenging, absolutely. And I think it is, they're going to be in the same boat as a lot of us. I think all you can really do in the first case is make sure you're really clear on what you are getting from whom and have those dialogues and discussions early, just so that you're aware of what that risk is and potentially what the impact if one of them did go under was. Beyond that, I guess there's really limited things you can do. When we talked about the strategic suppliers and identifying them, that may mean things like being a bit more relaxed about contract terms, about service delivery levels, and just about sort of the financial terms of those contracts.
And I think that's right. I'm just going to throw to you, Tony. You've just, I think you've got a couple of things to add on that. But I mean, one of the things we've talked about as a group is that some of the criteria for choosing a partner and provider has maybe shifted, right? And one of those might be that the fact that they're across the street was really highly important, only a month ago, and maybe the fact that they've got, in fact, a lot of people to help to throw at the problem might be more important than that today. But Tony, what do you have to add to that?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I mean, I think this is probably coming out of our general business advice at the moment in terms of contractors and even major customers as well. And I think the advice is engage in those discussions early. Don't sit and wait for a supplier or one of your major customers, an anchor tenant of your customer base, to come to you. Feel free to sort of get in touch with them early. Be constructive in the dialogue, and that might mean being creative, and as Jeff says, being perhaps a lot more understanding about the contractual arrangements that you have with those suppliers. I think from our perspective, realize that contracts aren't a risk mitigation in their own right. And that might seem strange, but if we've signed a contract with someone who has some service levels with associated liquidated damages or service credits, that still doesn't mean that you don't have the obligation to deliver your own services to your client base. And so even though you might have what you consider to be a watertight contract, it's unlikely that that will actually allow you to mitigate risks sufficiently on its own. The other thing that we've seen across a couple of industries is the need to look 1 to 2 levels beyond the primary supplier. An example would be a software supplier that we were working with, supplying into the financial services market, had looked at their business continuity planning and hadn't actually looked at the data center that they were being provided by a third party, which was crucial to their supply. So you can get yourself into some rabbit holes there where you go too many layers down. Looking, for instance, eventually at the electricity to supply to one of your suppliers might not be that constructive. But we would look to make sure that you are sort of looking at least that one level below the key supplier to understand who in turn their key suppliers were in order to deliver the service to you.
Thanks, Tony. Look, in the interest of time, we're right on 3 o'clock, and I'm just going to wrap up if that's all right. As I said a moment ago, there are email addresses and phone numbers on the page in front of you, and we very much welcome you to make direct contacts. I'm very aware we've got some other really good questions that we didn't get around to. I'm sorry about that. So just to summarize, technology leaders have spent their careers juggling priorities and juggling resources, and that is going to come to the fore even more as cost will be under pressure for most of you. Technology demand will also be there, and a great question about the fact that you've got people who've been working very hard, but that demand is not going to dry up or stop. So prioritization, we believe, is really vitally important, but at the same time, rapid delivery of technology and automation, particularly where there are process gaps, really does matter. And to achieve all of that, it's not going to be a silver bullet, but agility is going to be key. So look, again, thank you very much for joining us today. We've enjoyed the session. We hope you have. Very much welcome some feedback. and we look forward to talking to you again in the near future. Thank you very much, and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.